There were a few unfortunate children who possessed a personality. This dangerous sign was attacked at once, and strenuous efforts were made to make them as mindless as the rest. All personality was erased, and upon the palimpsest were inscribed the standardized views and doctrines of the educational board. For these reasons, though I was unconscious of the reason for my revolt, I hated school. How I hated it! I rarely walked into this dismal place. I was dragged there. And when I sat in my desk, I sat there like a fool. And at playtime, I would often stand apart from my playmates, brooding like a hurt animal. I never, and now I look upon it with pride, received a prize for regular attendance. The elastic moods of youth, the quick forgetfulness of sorrow, the spontaneous welcoming of a joyful moment, and the feverish restlessness for a long-awaited event, are incidents of the past that one sometimes meditates upon. And my sorrow was the entrance into school, my joyful moment, the release, the long-awaited event, the arrival of a holiday. And though these hours of release brought little of that lyrical quality that should be the heritage of every child, I yet returned with some slight regret to that period, for the crystalline quality of mind being lacking, a true understanding of this misery that surrounded me lost much of its poignancy. I think it is only in adolescence that feelings and thoughts become more intense, more sensitive afterwards. One becomes used to it all, dulled, fatalistic. The first few years after my schooling holds for me but little interest. The district in which we lived was much better. But as this a tale relating to the mind, there is little need to dwell upon these phases. I entered many trades, for but short periods, for I excelled in none, and often committed the fatal mistake of being either too painstaking or dreaming. Only one ideal helped me, an ideal possessed and dreamt over ever since childhood, to write a book. I had no other ideal save that one. Now, it was only at the age of 18 that I really began to think. Previously, the days had vanished like a continually moving curtain of mist, teaching me little, and leaving me in my mind a debris of uninteresting incident. And even when the fawn of adolescence stirred, I within me and warmed my blood with his passion music, when his melody ceased, there was little I to remember him by. It was only when the thin radiance of thought began to glimmer within mind that I began to realize that I possessed the power to place in their various apartments the things and ideas I had previously considered one and indivisible, that I was an individual with power to rebel against accepted concepts and conventions. How my emotions spluttered and frothed, I ignited by the electrical power of an idea, a new dream, a breath-shaking revelation. I attempted to illuminate and bomb with the fire within me those whom I met. But the insulations were faulty, therefore I expressed myself in a series of stammers intermixed with the intermittent flashes of brightness. I burned with a destructive fervor, and injustice was frequently the fuel that made me boil over and steam. The spirit of rebellion entered into me and intoxicated me, and with this came the growth of egotism and argumentative, callow cynicism. But in my mental birth I was feebly and primitively equipped, and I had to stumble on alone without the crutches of education to help me onward. Like a would-be knight without armor or steed, I endeavored to journey into the land of thought, bearing only the club of egotism with which to conquer my adversaries. Thus armed I strode onward, meeting after a few strides an atheist, a middle-aged man dwelling in a stone hut by the wayside, the background being sparse and arid, hillless and ending in the abyss of utter negation. He was a hermit, as primitive and as crude as myself, and he denounced and jeered at the existence of a god, shattering, lustily and lengthily, the beliefs of the Bible on the clumsily built anvil of his convictions. He was a good, simple, and sincere man, whose father, I believe, had been a parson. Conceivably, he had reacted against the narrowness of the teachings forced upon him, but that had not made him the less narrow in his reactions. The society to which this man belonged hated the idea of a god, hated the churches, and hated the priesthood, worshipping instead the teachings of the materialistic-minded scientist. And I believe their characters were just as fanatical and capable of indulging in autos da fe and other torments, had they lived in such a period, as the opponents they attacked. For despite their scientific knowledge, they seem to be incapable of understanding that it would be as hard to eradicate from these people who possessed a different consciousness their knowledge and sense of divine realities, as it would be to change the shape of a star. For they squeezed and crushed all knowledge brought to them in the vice of intolerance. Previously I had believed in God without knowing the existence of other theories, praying to him simply and naturally and in perfect faith, not deeming that the interpretations of life were as multitudinous and as various as the leaves on a tree, not having had any strong religious training, for our parents permitted us to think as we desired, evoking therefore no religious discussion in the home. The theories of my atheistical companion interested me considerably, though at first I was somewhat disturbed, for the bed of my beliefs was comfortable and warm. But after giving ear to many of his now obviously crude arguments, in which coarse humor was often used as a further nail thrust into the coffin of God, and thinking over much that he said, I accepted his views, not possessing sufficient education or discrimination to reject. From that moment I commenced arguing as vigorously and as absurdly as my newly discovered friend, but strange to say, blasphemy never became the weapons of my attack. Now, had I become somebody strange and daring? I was an atheist. Not many people I discovered were atheists. I was virile in attack, and long words. We favored long words because they sounded more impressive, floated down like logs of wood from the tongue. Also, I was unsparing in the use of my club. All those who disbelieved in me were my enemies, and I attempted to batter in, by sheer strength and weight, their thick, intolerant skulls. What disreputable children they truly were. Seriousness lay upon us like clogs of lead. If only we had possessed a sense of humor, but that came later. As yet the mist of philosophy had not enshrouded me, and therefore I did not understand that dogmatism in the realm of thought was absurd. Therefore I stayed with my friend for a considerable time, while he initiated me into ponderous books of popular science, wherein the word evolution was the power that dethroned God. Upon such altars in the temple of evolution, these priests of materialism sacrificed all other creeds as fanatically as did the priesthood in the medieval ages, not understanding that their worshippers were just as ignorant and just as thoughtless as the worshippers of others in the opposing temples. Yet I think that they have an important part to play in the journeyings and development of the mental traveler, for they wipe away all the prejudices and superstitions accepted from childhood without question. From that aspect, my meeting with the atheist was of great value, though, like others, I rapidly made new prejudices, for character does not alter with the birth of new teachings or theories, and I became a general nuisance to all who opposed me, laughing to scorn those who rejected my superficial arguments, and being ignored naturally, by those who understood my youthful state of mind. But those who accepted similar theories treated me seriously, for we considered ourselves intellectually superior to those who gazed upon the plains below. But after many months I became tired of this storyland, and so I decided to travel still farther. I had been told that beyond the frontier of atheism stretched a land named socialism, a wonderful and perfect land, a land of cool and refreshing streams and woodlands that sparkled with the gay music of birds and the light fragrance of myriad flowers. A land where here perfection radiated from the forms and faces nobly proportioned men and women. A land of Arcady where all were given equal opportunity to express the highest within them. In short, a fragrant social paradise given to man because of the love that the givers felt in their hearts for all humanity. So hopefully I resumed my pilgrimage. Soon after I came to a long, broad and smooth road of a red color. Flowers grew by the wayside, which when I plucked from them I found to be artificial. This astonished me, but I soon forgot as I gazed at the quiet beauty that surrounded me. The sun was just rising, another curious phenomena, for it never topped the valley towards which I travelled. But it was when turning a corner that the sound of a mighty clamor reached my ears. This, I exclaimed, should not be. Alas, I, perhaps a jealous enemy, had invaded this land of perfection. So I hurried forward, and the clamor increased, while the clockwork birds that greeted me ceased from singing. Now ultimately I arrived at the drawbridge of a castle built from scarlet stone, and this castle was besieged by an army who wore uniforms of red, and they made the clamor. From one of them I discovered that those in the castle were of the same blood as those who besieged, but that the besieged had drawn up a certain custom that was not to the liking of those who attacked. These I left, for I did not understand the reason for their quarrel. Thus I travelled farther, and the sounds that rent the air grew more ferocious. But they did not float from those whom I left, but from another quarter. And again, when I reached the spot from whence the sound rolled, I found that another battle was in being, and that the cause was of a similar nature to the armies I had just left. Then I joined one of the armies and became a mercenary, for otherwise I could not have travelled onward, for castles lay thickly on the land, and battles occurred daily. Thus I became an archer, wearing a quiver loaded with the barbed arrows of argument, which I shot forth to all who opposed the particular views I had at that moment. In this land all the inhabitants were in a continual stage of siege, and each castle was surrounded by a red mist. Here I remained for a considerable time, travelling from one castle to another, and endeavouring to discover the reason for the enmity that existed between them all. Many of the soldiers swore that their opponents were dishonest and insincere. Others held that certain rites in their churches of love were blasphemous. Others maintained that certain rules laid down by their kings should be obeyed, and others disagreed, and still more believed that their great enemy, the golden giant, had paid their opponents to spy upon them. Perhaps these were the reasons why the sun never rose. It was a realm where suspicion and misrule were the true sovereigns, and where the arrows of argument were shut down in a perpetual shower. Now, traveling from castle to castle, I eventually came to the borders of this country, beyond which lay the nebulous and dark valleys of anarchism. And here I discovered the philosophy of the ego-intoxicated Nietzsche. And here I've discovered the philosophy of the ego-intoxicated Nietzsche and Max Stirner, whose god was the Superman Black occultism. In this night land, the doctrines of self were preached, perfect and undiluted freedom for the individual, an inversion of the true occult ideal, in which man is considered a world, but wherein, before he can perfect freedom for soul expression, He must be perfect physically, emotionally, and mentally. That is, he must be balanced in every attribute of his being and ever willing to help humanity. The reverse is then the black magician who wars against humanity, but who has also developed power and dark wisdom. Thus, we can see that in anarchism, the darker side of liberty for the individual is expressed. Now, the people I met were not at all of a bad nature, and certainly they were much more finely evolved and milder than the socialist. They were more or less atheistical, and because of that believed that the powers in man were limited. Thus they could only and did not theorize. The truth was they were more or less philosophers holding almost identical doctrines. Thus they could only and did theorize. The truth was that they were more or less philosophers holding almost identical doctrines. In this realm, I threw away my quiver of arrows and exchanged it for the swiftly darting rapier, and I roamed, like the eye rest, alone. I endeavored to gather material for an ambitious work entitled Egotism, Past, Present, and Future. A work that was to be written in 3 vast volumes to prove conclusively how man had risen through the evolution of selfishness and how he would ultimately become a god through a similar development. I did not know at the time that selfishness possesses the seed of its own destruction, but I mentioned this literary attempt of mine, which needless to say did not go beyond a few pages of notes, in order to show the mental state and youthfulness of my mind. For even had I had the will to accomplish such a feat, I lacked the knowledge to complete it. Now the people in this dark land were in a hurry. With the mighty broom of anarchism, we determined to sweep and cleanse the world. It was to be a universal spring cleaning, wherein we were to be the cleaners. In the first place, we wanted to destroy all tyrants, or at least put them where they would do the least harm to society. We abolished them by the simple process of passing resolutions for revolutions. Unfortunately, we did not discriminate between the two words. To us, they apparently meant the same. Eagerly, we wanted that which would give us comfort and time to think, and we did not realize that other people were satisfied with the existing state of society. Because we were restless, we wanted all others to be likewise. And I think that socialism, anarchism, and all the other destructive forms of beliefs are the result of a mental adolescence, an adolescence intended for all those who strive to better their own conditions of life. For though we speak of 3 classes of society, we forget another aspect, that of caste. It is possible, in fact, I am certain, that hopelessly mixed in our unripe civilization are castes whose worlds of thought are as distinct and as far apart as the stars. Among these anarchists, I awakened my mental youth, a youth anointed with the holy oil of dream, a youth virile and passionate, a youth that shook and whipped the blood into fury at the stupidity and selfishness of class and nation. My mind became like a newly broached casket filled with a strong burning wine, and thoughts, dreams, visions raced tumultuously within me as a torrent as I became intoxicated through its strength. My soul was a clenched fist that desired to strike and strike and strike against all the inhumanities that surrounded me. I was in that spring that is more passionate, more vital, more than all the other springs through which the soul passes on its pilgrimage. And that was the spring of ideals, a spring that is the echo of divine vitality. The crimson banner became my symbol, the symbol of social perfection wherein injustice and inequality and hunger would find no place, and pictures of gracious cities, clean limbed, regal people, and atmospheres of golden, serene beauty dawned from the ecstasies of my revolutionary moods. The fire of my ideals warmed and comforted me in the midst of a cold and comfortless world. Each ideal was a beacon from which I gathered a new fuel and fire to light the hearts and minds of the mass. Being extremely sensitive, I was easily impressed by the sentimental eloquence of every revolutionary orator, and I would boil over a moment at all the injustices related to me. How indignant I felt, how I would denounce with words of vitriol and hate a party or a politician. Afterwards, a sense of humor was born, and I became more balanced and finally contemptuous of these people who overexercise their lungs to an undiscriminating, mindless audience. And also, I found that their characters did not possess the golden quality that their theories did. Nevertheless, I plucked from this spring many beautiful flowers. For beyond all the vagueness and muddle mindedness of these people stood a good and noble force that would ultimately raise man onto a loftier plane wherein dwelt cleanliness and brightness. I think society will remain immature as long as man remains immature. For though the tender force of a high dream may stretch down and entwine itself around the heart of man, there are the myriad mirages. There are the myriad im- there are the myriad mirages that distract and bewilder him. And though he may hear a weeping in his heart and an urge to enter into silence of the higher self, he is too weak and too young to translate and understand this divine force that all the prophets and poets of the ages have hearkened to. Instead, often the voice of the streams make him uneasy, and he plunges still further into things that he can understand. But I believe that dream is the voice of the higher self demanding obedience from its human instrument, and will not release the heart of man from its tendrils, but will compel man to accept it, not by love, then by pain, its ideal, and only then will society blossom into maturity. Therefore, though in those early days I was eager to give to all I met my newly discovered wealth, and further attempted to force it into the heads of all I met, I soon realized the psychological differences in people and discovered the utter futility of propaganda for those not ready for it. For even if those people followed one's doctrines, the fact that much would not be understood would lead to a state of society more chaotic than harmonious. Likewise, I have been told by my teacher since that it is necessary to let other minds alone, for often their roads of development lie in different directions. The higher self knows better than we do what is best for its instrument. Yet it was through anarchism that I learned that each person was a world in which different ways of thinking were as immutable as natural laws. And it was likewise through this conclusion that I left the chaotic and dark valleys of anarchism and journeyed into the vaster and in many ways vaguer realms of philosophy. Traveling into the country of the philosophers, I was compelled to throw away my rapier. Of what use the sword of argument to combat a mirage, and instead bear a distaff? For here I gathered the uncarded wool of ideas discarded from old and young philosophers who were seated beside their wheels spinning finely spun theories. What wondrous fabrics were woven! There were clothes soft and smooth, spun for patrician, mental bodies, warm and comforting wools for optimistic thinkers, and thin and threadbare, and thin and threadbare materials for the superficial intellectual. And like the others, I sat down and wove for myself a suit. But what queer assorted cloth came from my loom? What strange tints and threads were blended? It was neither linen nor sackcloth, canvas or satin. It was a combination of all kinds, and the costume that I wore was a trifle clumsy in the beginning and grotesque of the fashionably clad beholder. But it fitted me well enough to suit my purpose, though after a while some pieces were taken out and replaced by patches that harmonized more completely to my state of mind. When I had roamed in the land of anarchism, I had assumed that beyond its borders lay an unfathomable nothingness, and that my mental evolution had ended, and that the next best thing I could do was to gather as much knowledge as this country possessed. Thus, when I stepped over its borders, laden with the twin beliefs of atheism and anarchism into the land of philosophy, it was with great doubt and uncertainty, for here all things were of an insubstantial nature. My belief in the greatness of the individual was of little use. Life, these weavers and spinners said, may be but an idea spun from intangible substances. The body does not exist, only mind. All is force, matter, time, length, breadth, and width are but the boundaries of motion. Man is a mote as unimportant as the speck of dust. Man is a universe, and the suns and stars are his dreams. Of what use then were my dogmatisms? For these philosophers proved to me that the very ground upon which I walked was but shaped from mist and quicksand. Slowly, I began to realize how little I really knew, for far beyond well-trodden pastures of the mild-eyed philosophers who spend their days unraveling the old patterns of ideas left to them by their dead brothers, reweaving them into patterns and designs of new theories, lay a vast shadowy coastline towards which I determined to travel, since these philosophers had melted my materialistic dogmatisms. Now, the greater problems of life were set before me. One was the problem of existence. I had believed we were as tapers, molded by environment, while the wick was kindled by an unconscious mechanical force, and it burned on until the taper melted and returned to the elements. Life was reasonless, and because of that, we were compelled to bring a reason into it. Further suffering was the largesse of life, distributed in too generous quantities. For, we argued, surely no God would be so cruel as to give pain to his creation. I had not yet investigated the phenomena of spiritualism, nor had I even heard of theosophy. So the keys to certain problems of existence had not yet been placed in my hands. I saw that anarchism led to the belief in the power of brute force physically and mentally, for one can fight for power as brutally on the mental plane as upon the physical. I saw that the use of class war was no true and lasting remedy, for such hate and selfishness would only be a productive of still greater disharmony. Slowly and ever more deeply a great mental agony possessed me. An unbearable anguish burned into me. I felt so unutterably weak and futile. Rhetoric and coarse humiliation could not help the miserable beggar, could not dissolve the hate and suspicion each nation hurled at one another, a hate that corroded and blistered the social body and poisoned its blood. The disciples of these reforming creeds were too imperfect themselves. Therefore, through I studied philosophy. Therefore, through I studied philosophy in order to find an answer that would satisfy me. I did not, and the hungry were still the symbols of the pitiless loss of life. For life itself seemed as a terrible living picture that enrobed the whole earth, whereupon forces like giant feet trod and smeared into scarlet splashes all things that breathed. This state of mind continued for a long time, until one day I met an old socialist who broached to me the subject of spiritualism. Though I listened keenly to him, his illogical arguments and illustrations irritated me. I told him plainly that I considered such beliefs absurd, primitive, and impossible. I should have known better. Philosophy had proved to me long ago the futility of dogmatism. Nevertheless, I attended a séance and was amused and appalled. The picture of apparently sane men and women, especially women, seated earnestly in a darkened room, holding hands and waiting expectantly to hear messages from the spirits of dead friends and relations through the mouths of the mediums, held for me at that time not only a sense of its pathos but also of its humor. It was all very interesting, but these people seemed far too ready to accept as genuine any vague statement that the medium or obsessing entity desired to give, snatching at each fragment of information as though starving, without question or desire to know whether the food given came from the mind of the medium or truly from a disembodied spirit. I concluded from the results of my first visit that there was too little proof in the study of this subject. Still, I thought it was worthwhile examining the psychological aspect, and spiritualism from it was from that aspect that I attacked these beliefs and strove to find whether there were any scientific justification for this subject. It was while on this quest that I came to the science of hypnotism, and herein I found much more proof about the possible powers of the mind than I had ever yet conceived. For I never realized what forces lay dormant within the brain until that moment, though later on I was to learn of still greater and more wonderful powers of which certainly the Western students of psychology and hypnotism are ignorant. A little later on I heard of another theory about life, which was theosophy. Curiosity led me into a hall where lectures upon such a subject were being delivered, and while listening to lecturer a realization dawned within me, clarifying all the vague and half-formed intuitions that had glimmered within my mind since childhood. One afternoon another problem began to be solved. The past beliefs of childhood, such as magic, fairies, religion, and God, again resumed their sovereignty, though of course the theosophical terms were different. Thus, fairies were elementals, magic unknown laws, the logos God, but what mattered terms as long as they meant the same. Another reason why I listened so eagerly and accepted much that was said was not because the speaker awakened old and beautiful beliefs, but because he was so reasonable, explaining the solution to so many problems. We had lived before, and in our past lives did things that produced reactions in this. Hence, were all our sufferings not caused by God, but by our own actions. We also had the free will to do good or evil, those choosing evil learning through suffering to do good, and those doing good learning to become instruments for divine purposes. And here I will quote a teaching given to me since by my teacher. The black powers of life are needed, because through opposition man calls out to God for right direction. The seeker is brought into touch with those dark forces in order to give him the power to discriminate between right and wrong action. Thus in theosophy, intelligent, though unfamiliar, reasons were given to explain many things, and in this new world of thought spread before me, I determined to banquet. I had a prodigious appetite, nothing was cast away. I digested words in which even theosophists were not interested, and here and there I found a little tidbit that mixed well with the varied and strange foods I discovered. Pamphlets and booklets were my first choice. Then came 3 huge volumes of a work that is treated with a contempt it certainly does not deserve, namely, The Secret Doctrine, the most remarkable book, I venture to suggest, of the 19th century. But I was compelled to put it aside as it dealt with subjects much profound for my understanding. But more elementary works of a kindred nature were read at the rate of about a dozen a week. For I joined the library of the Theosophical Society. The number of books written upon this philosophy are immense, and it was in this library that I had the opportunity of studying the scientific basis for their beliefs, though I know full well that the scientist would not even attempt to study and examine if there was any possible truth in this doctrine. He is much too superior for that. And after all, is not a study of the habits of a beetle of much more importance than an understanding of the spirit of things and of God. Meanwhile, I still attended in a cursory fashion the spiritualist seance and began to get some more proof in a most unpleasant manner. After leaving these circles, phenomena would take place when I was alone. I would hear taps and knocks at night, and on one or two occasions I had the unpleasant and uncanny experience of something dragging me out of my body. This gave me unwelcome proof, inconceivable as it may sound to the materialist, that I possessed another form of consciousness within my body, a detachable something that is fully conscious and aware that the body is but a kind of envelope. I can hear the mental specialist and psychologist who, never having had such an experience, therefore deny the possibility, murmuring in kind of firm accents that I apparently had some strange form of hallucination. All is an hallucination to the blind and inexperienced, and to those who will not see, but nevertheless, I maintain that such was an experience that occurred. It was as though something had been unlocked and shown to me, warning me that spiritualism had its dangers. Spiritualism, I think, is a land of earnest and unhappy slaves, where many are burdened with strange and miserable creatures who leer and gibber from the backs of their carriers, slaves who are weak and half blind and know not what horrible creatures possess them. It is a land where curiosity, grief, and greed are the masters, attracting many voyagers to moor their barks in one of the shadowy heavens. A land wherein everything appears distorted, where trees are curiously shaped and unhealthily colored, their branches grey, writhing and coiling like living things, their foliage thick and glossy with disease stab, and where even the dark grasses rustle when there is no wind. Here a sombre miasma rises continually from a marshy earth, where the waters of pool and stream are brown and stagnant, save for a radiant brook that flows from a distant mountain range. And this brook is one of those white threads of truth that run through age to age, through civilization to civilization, bringing with it an eternal light and murmuring an eternal yet ever-changing hymn for those who are willing to see and hear. Through such a land had I wandered, meeting people who had we and blindly stumbled through the entangling jungles. For spiritualism is often a roadless land, wherein to journey is to travel with ears deaf to the wild laughter and howling of unseen hosts, people proud and delighted in being obsessed, being sincere in their beliefs that the spirits possessing their bodies use them for unselfish motives, and quite opposite motives were usually much in evidence. These people desired to be instruments of God, but unfortunately they left the cellar doors of the human house wide open, permitting an invasion of unholy spirits who sometimes reigned supreme. And though bewilderment and fascination had entranced them, if they had but listened more keenly, they would have heard in the distance the frail whisper of the silver stream, and if they had but developed sufficient strength to travel towards it, they would ultimately pass out of the grey and evil mist of this land and enter a country of brighter hues, where the flower-fringed ribbon of light grew broader and flowed into the river that journeyed through the continent named Theosophy. Incidentally, a few remarks from my teacher regarding spiritualism may be of interest. The child must take its first step in the attainment towards the realization of truth, and in its stumbling often wanders into the mazes underlying spiritualism as it is understood. But a pure mind and heart will lead him through this land of mist and bewilderment into the world of soul's awakening. Therefore, he should not be condemned if he is sincere, for there are many paths to God. So these experiences prepared me to accept much that the Theosophists claimed, and I learned that in seeking and discovering there is no end. The mental vistas broaden daily, wider and wider grow the fields of knowledge, for every inch of space and air teems with invisible intelligences of a most wonderful and varied nature, titanic as well as minute. Thank you for this reading. Hope I'll see you again. Welcome to Fool's Journey.